The social behavior, social practice, and attitude associated with colonialism constitute colonial discourse, which can be identified through the post-colonial theories of Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Homi K. Baba, Albert Memmi, and Frantz Fanon. This lecture is about Edward Said and his post-colonial theory. Edward Said is a great intellectual, literary theorist, historian, and critic. His works educate us about the question how colonialism and colonial discourse work. Said's theory is based on the relationship of knowledge and power. He argues that knowledge is not innocent but profoundly connected with the operations of power. In his book Orientalism, Said shows how the relationship of power and knowledge was exploited by the European colonial powers to establish their authority over the Oriental nations. They also supported their viewpoint through other disciplines such as philology, history, anthropology, philosophy, archaeology, and literature. Orientalism uses the concepts of discourse to reorder the study of colonialism, which inaugurated a new kind of study. Said argues that the Europeans were telling lies and they individually dislike non-Western peoples or cultures. During the 18th century, England became a superpower and it occupied many countries all over the world. It became the empire over which the sun never set. There was a huge expansion and geographical discoveries all the time. The Great Britain and other strong nations invaded the weak nations and took them into their clutches. The weak nations became the colonies of the strong nations. The two words imperialism and colonialism came into existence. Imperialism is an ideological factor and colonialism tells us that some nations remained in the control of others at various times. During this period of subjugation, the socio-political and ideological system of the colonized nations were affected to a great extent. Colonialism is a practice of dominion which involves the subjugation of one nation to another. Imperialism is an ideological concept which upholds the legitimacy of the economic and military control of one nation by another. Imperialism is not concerned with the issue of settlement. It is the extension and expansion of trade and commerce under the protection of political, legal, and military controls. Colonialism is only one form of practice which results from the ideology of imperialism and specifically concerns with the settlement of one group of people in a new location. Colonialism is one specific experience of how imperialism can work through the act of settlement, and colonialism was a lucrative commercial operation bringing wealth and riches to Western nations through the economic exploitations of the colonized countries. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country. In colonialism, there are two classes of people, the colonizers and the colonized. The British and the Nigerians, for example, and the British and the Egyptians. The French and the Algerians, the Belgians and the Congolese, the Great British or the Great Britain invaded many parts of the African and considered them as vulgar. The British themselves considered as superiors having knowledge, education, and they felt very important as civilized nations of the world. For them, Africans, Arabs, Indians, Muslims, all are low classes people without any culture and civilization. They considered them as inferiors. Edward Said attracted the attention of critics towards an innovative reality in English literature. His theory is based on the argument that the system of colonialism works not just through armies or force but through a discourse. He argues that the European writers established their superiority through colonial discourse. They inculcated a sense of inferiority in the colonized nation. His theory informs us that the West painted a picture of the Orientals in their own imagination. The English authors and poets presented the view that the people of East or Orient are without any values and culture. The basic point of Said's theory is that the 19th century and the 20th century Western literature is full of superiority of the European nations. He further adds that in present era the same role is played by the Western media. The media carries a discourse that the Africans are corrupt and encourage dictatorship. Latin Americans are drug lords, Arabs are terrorists, and the Asians are religious fanatics. The media has depicted this in the minds of the Western nations. His theory is based on the relationship of knowledge and power and informs the Orientals that knowledge is not innocent but profoundly connected with the operations of power. In his book Orientalism, Said shows how the relationship of power and knowledge was exploited by the European colonial powers to establish their authority over the Oriental nations. They also supported their viewpoint through literary and non-literary texts. These texts reorder the facts and reality in the light of their own discourse. This discourse is based on a biased approach and propagated about non-Western peoples and their cultures. Anya Lumba, in her book Colonialism, Postcolonialism, endorses the basic thesis of Said and argues that the vision in Orientalism is based on reality. She further adds that the biased and loaded discourse of the English writers divided the cultures and values distinctively. She terms this division as a binary opposition between East and West. This binary opposition spread the propaganda that the values of the West are superior and the East as inferior. This sense of superiority and inferiority is promoted in the literature and other disciplines. The Great Britain and other strong nations invaded the weak nations and took them into their clutches. The weak nations became the colonies of the strong nations. The two words imperialism and colonialism came into existence. Said informs us about the text of English literature, history, and other writings and argues that the writers of the 19th century incorporated a discourse about the other nations. This established discourse has far-sighted linguistic, cultural, and psychological repercussions which are discussed by Amy Caesar in his book Discourse on Colonialism. Caesar states that the subjugated population is kept in control for exploitation and dramatic impacts of political and economic control and may continue after a state gains independence. The major points of Said's theory is that the Orient could not represent itself to the world. Said's critical approaches can be applied and observed in the text Heart of Darkness, Lord Jim, A Passage to India as examples. Robert Young, in his book Postcolonialism, a very short introduction, states that Said's theories shifted the focus of critics to a new dimension. He informs us that every representation is misrepresentation, and representation in the literary texts, travel writings, memoirs, and academic studies could be analyzed as a mean for understanding the diverse ideological practices of colonialism. In his opinion, the language implied in the literary and non-literary works of Western writers written during the colonial period is not transparent, innocent, ahistorical, or merely instrumental. He argues that Orient is the stage on which the whole East is confined, and such biased perception hindered a true understanding of the Oriental cultures. According to Said, the major dilemma of the Orient is its failure to represent itself to the Western world. Consciously and unconsciously, certain phenomena are introduced in the English literature. These are based on its imaginative creation. He informs us about the mentality of the Western nations. He further adds that Western and European nations consider that their social norms are superior, and the Orients are not aware of any culture and civilization. The basic point of Said's theory is the binary opposition between the East and West, which is identified as a political vision of reality in his book Orientalism. The gulf between the West and East rests upon the assumption that Orientals remained backward, primitive, and marginalized. In the same way, his posthumous book, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, is a true reflection of the Saidian philosophy, as the book juxtaposes his political activism as a critic within a democratic society. The philosophy of Said is more political and is quite close to the Foucauldian's relationship of power and knowledge for the political dominance. The book articulates the assumptions underlying Said's previous works and raises questions about the viability of his humanistic philosophy to raise a voice for the exploited and to expose the hidden forces of exploitation. In Humanism and Democratic Criticism, Said contends that the words are not merely passive figures but vital agents in historical and political change. He maintains that the European colonial powers established their cultural hegemony and authority over the Oriental nations. This was about the post-colonial theory of Edward Said, and in the following lectures we will continue the rest of the critics and their contribution about the post-colonial theory. Thank you very much for your kind attention.